So I'm going to introduce our first speaker. So our first speaker is Kimberly Murray. Kimberly Murray is the independent special interlocutor for missing children and unmarked graves and burial sites associated with Indian residential schools. Kimberly Murray is a member of the Kahnesatake Mohawk Nation. She's currently the executive lead for the newly created Survivors Secretariat at the Six Nations of the Grand River, working to recover the missing children and unmarked burials at the Mohawk Institute. Prior to this role, Ms. Murray was the province's first ever Assistant Deputy Attorney General for Indigenous Justice from April 1st, 2015 to April 2nd, 2021, where she was responsible for creating a unit to work with Indigenous communities on revitalizing their Indigenous laws and legal orders. In 2018 to 2019, Ms. Murray chaired the expert panel on policing in Indigenous communities, which produced the report Towards Peace, Harmony, and Well-Being. From 2010 to 2015, Ms. Murray was the Executive Director of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, where she worked to ensure the survivors of Canada's residential school systems were heard and remembered, and to promote reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. From 1995 to 2010, Ms. Murray was staff lawyer and then Executive Director of Aboriginal Legal Services of Toronto. She has appeared before all levels of courts on Indigenous legal issues. She's acted as counsel at numerous coroner inquests and public inquiries, including the Ipperwash Inquiry in Ontario and the Frank Paul Inquiry in British Columbia. Ms. Murray is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Diane Martin Medal for Social Justice Through Law, the City of Toronto's Aboriginal Affairs Access, Equity, and Human Rights Award, the Law Foundation's Guthrie Award, the Law Society of Ontario Laura Legge Award, and the 2017 National Aboriginal Achievement Award for Law and Justice. In 2015, the Indigenous Bar Association granted Ms. Murray the Indigenous Peoples Council designation. Most recently, Ms. Murray was awarded the Lieutenant Governor's Medal of Distinction in Public Administration. So she will be speaking about how missing data impacts Indigenous communities. Let's welcome her to the stage.
Sego, Seguego, Skinagoa, Kimberly Murray, Yungats, Ganye, Gahaga, Kahnesatake Mohawk. Good morning, everyone. As you heard, I'm Kimberly Murray. I'm Mohawk of Kahnesatake Mohawk Nation, and I'm very humbled to be the independent special interlocutor for missing children and unmarked burials. I'm going to guess that probably everyone in this room never thought that we would have a position in Canada whose main role is to help communities find missing children and unmarked burials in this country. I want to say thank you to Kashana for the kind introduction, and to Toronto Women in Data Sciences for inviting me to share some words on the importance of data in the search for missing children and unmarked burials. I too want to start by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples who have taken care of the lands that this conference is being held on, which includes the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. I also acknowledge the various treaties that cover this territory, including the Dish with One Spoon, Treaty 13, and the Williams Treaties. I honor the principles of peace, friendship, and respect that underlie these treaty relationships. I also want to recognize that Toronto, or rather as we say in Mohawk, Duranto, has been and continues to be the home of many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and has been my home for over 30 years. I've been asked to speak this morning on how missing data has impacted the sacred work of searching for and recovering children in unmarked burials. Before I speak to that, I thought I would first speak how we got here, how we came to have this need for a special interlocutor for missing children and unmarked burials. So, for over 100 years, 150,000 First Nation, Inuit, and Métis children were taken from their loving parents, families, and communities, and they were placed in Indian residential schools or federal hostels. These federally funded institutions were operated by various church entities, including the Catholic, Anglican, United, and Presbyterian churches. The stated purpose of these institutions was to kill the Indian in the child. The first institution to open was right here in Ontario, the Mohawk Institute. It's a mere 90-minute drive from Toronto in Brantford, Ontario. It opened its doors in 1828 and operated until 1970. It is commonly known to the survivors as the Mush Hole. It's named the Mush Hole after the horrible mushy porridge that they were served as breakfast every single morning. It was the longest operating Indian residential school in the country. The building still stands, and it's a reminder to all Canadians of the genocidal policy that Canada embarked on to eradicate Indigenous people and to steal their lands. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission found that there was an urgent need to develop historically literate citizens who understand why and how the past is relevant to their own lives and the future of the country. So, I'm going to give you some facts. There are 145 institutions recognized under the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. That means 145 institutions that Canada was found to have funded for the purpose of stealing kids from their families. The last institute to close in Canada was the Gordon Indian Residential School in Saskatchewan in 1996. There were 18 Indian residential schools in the province of Ontario. The last one to close in Ontario was in 1991. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, during its 5 years mandate, collected statements from over 7,000 survivors. The TRC also collected over 5 million documents and records from the federal government and the church entities that operated these institutions. These records and statements of survivors are now in the archives at the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation in Winnipeg, Manitoba. These statements and these records relay the historical truths that children were stolen from their parents and their communities. They were locked in these places where their language and culture were beat out of them. Little children were physically, sexually, spiritually, and emotionally abused, and many died. Many died, and their bodies were never returned home to their families. Many are buried in unmarked burials, yet to be found. There are some hard questions that need to be answered. Who are the children that died? What did the children die from? Where are the children buried? And how many children died and are still missing? These are the questions that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission started to answer in Volume 4 of its final report. It focused on the missing children in unmarked burials. The TRC heard about and saw many unmarked burials and believed that there are similar burials at the former site of each and every Indian residential school across the country. The documents collected by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission revealed that the policies and the laws to protect the children while at Indian residential school were either absent or slow to be implemented, and those that might have existed were actually rarely enforced. The work of the TRC found that there were many different causes of death of the children, including disease, accidents, neglect, mistreatment, and criminal acts. The TRC highlighted the need for further work to be done to locate and protect unmarked burials, and to find a way to identify the children who were never returned home to their families. This sacred work that the TRC did to recovering the children was left unfinished. Calls to action 71 through 76 of its final report identify some of the steps needed to support communities with finding and identifying the children. These calls to action have yet to be fully implemented. In May of 2021, Tk'emlúps Secwépemc shared with the world that they had identified, through the use of ground-penetrating radar, 215 potential burials of children at the former site of the Kamloops Indian Residential School. Immediately, Canada announced that it was going to appoint an independent special interlocutor. It took over a year for Canada to put the mandate in place. And my mandate includes speaking with survivors and communities leading this sacred work of recovering the children and hearing from them about the barriers they are facing as they try to locate, identify, protect, and commemorate the children. As I do this work, I'm guided by several key principles, and I share 5 of these principles with you today. And as I do this, I ask you to consider how data science can help to support these principles. First, the bodies and spirits of missing Indigenous children must be treated with honor, respect, and dignity. This is so vitally important because these children were not treated with honor, respect, and dignity when they were stolen from their families and placed in these institutions. They were not treated with honor, respect, and dignity when they died and were buried in unmarked graves, hundreds of miles away from their parents, families, and communities. They were not treated with honor, respect, and dignity when their parents were not told of their deaths, of how they died, or where they are buried. Today, the spirits of these children deserve all the honor and respect and dignity that we can provide. Second, survivors must also be honored and acknowledged for raising public awareness about the truths of unmarked burials. Survivors have been speaking about the deaths of the children and the fact that there were burials at these places. Many spoke of this fact that they were actually forced to dig the graves where the children are now being found. Although they were sharing these truths for decades, Canada was not listening and not hearing. Today, we must listen, and we must hear, and we must act. Third principle, Indigenous families and communities have the right to know what happened to their children who died while in the care of the state. This right to know is an internationally recognized right held by victims of mass human rights breaches. They have a right to know the truth and to protect the truth. Canada also has international obligations to ensure that victims of the genocide and violence have access to the information that can help them determine the truth about the events surrounding the violations of their human rights. This right to know is not only an individual right, it is a collective right. So we can draw on the past to prevent future violations so that the same atrocities never happen again in Canada. The fourth principle, the search for unmarked burials and the recovery of missing Indigenous children must be governed by Indigenous laws and the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. The Declaration establishes the minimum human rights standards of Indigenous people worldwide. These standards must be met, measured, and monitored. And finally, the fifth guiding principle is that searches and investigations must follow the truth. This requires tracing the movement of each child using records and survivor testimonies from when the child was first taken to an Indian residential school through to the other institutions or locations they were sent. We are learning that the children were often sent to other places, like federal Indian hospitals, sanatoria, mental health institutions, and provincial hospitals, provincial reformatories, and industrial schools. Many believe, including myself, that there are likely unmarked burials of children at these institutions as well. So data is important. Data is important as communities do this sacred work of recovering the children. The TRC recognized this. Data is important to document the history of the genocide in this country. Data is important because without it, the deniers will continue to deny, and future generations will be led to forget. And when we forget, we are at risk of it happening again. Prior to its final report in 2015, the TRC issued an interim report. The interim report spoke of the importance of the historical records. It noted that its efforts to collect documents included records of at least 88 church archives and as many as 30 or more government institutions. It also said the creation of a full record would require the collection of records held by organizations and individuals other than Canada and the churches, such as museums, provincial and university archives, and cultural and Aboriginal research centers. At the time of the interim report, the TRC highlighted the lack of the federal government and church cooperation. This lack of cooperation resulted in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission having to go to court to fight for the records. Unfortunately, 11 years later, the fight for the records is not over. Communities continue to battle with various institutions to gain unfettered access to the archives so that they can help find the names of all the children that were taken to Indian residential schools, to look for those that died and find their burial locations, whether it be in marked graves in a municipal or church cemetery, or in unmarked graves on a site associated with the residential school. Recently, in 2019, the International Council on Archives Indigenous Working Group issued a declaration that speaks to what Indigenous people have been saying for years. Archives are unwelcoming colonial spaces. They hold millions of records that government and church officials created as they regulated and managed every aspect of Indigenous people's lives. Records with information about individuals, families, and communities that was gathered without their knowledge or their consent. Today, Indigenous people are asking, how do we get the data back? And what do I mean when I use the term data? It is more than records. It is knowledge. It is truth. It's history. Data is information and more. Desi Rodriguez-Lombert, Assistant Professor of Sociology and American Indian Studies at the University of California, has pointed out that Indigenous people have always been data gatherers with advanced systems of knowledge. She says that Indigenous people were and are data warriors. Data is everywhere, and survival was often tied to one's ability to gather, analyze, and share knowledge. Data, however, has only value depending on who controls it. When we speak about the sacred work of recovering the children, we must ask ourselves these questions about information that can help find the children and their burials. First, who owns the data? Who controls the data? Who has access to the data? And who possesses the data? When we speak of data relating to Indigenous people, we must also speak of Indigenous data sovereignty. Indigenous data sovereignty includes many things. It is the ownership of historic and current identity, including intellectual property, such as language, stories, songs, worldviews, cultural signs, symbols, records, and information. It is the right of Indigenous peoples to own, control, access, and possess data that derive from them and which pertain to a nation's membership, knowledge systems, customs, or territories. In practice, Indigenous data sovereignty means that Indigenous people need to be the decision makers in how data about them is utilized. Indigenous governance is key to ensuring that Indigenous values, rights, and interests guide decision-making about how data is collected, accessed, stored, and used. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission wrote extensively about the importance of data in many sections of its report and in its 94 calls to action, whether it be in measuring progress to closing gaps in education and income, measuring the state of health of Indigenous peoples, or the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the child welfare and criminal justice system. With respect to missing children, the TRC highlighted some significant challenges. They noted that the number of children who died in Canada's Indian residential schools is not likely to ever be known. The TRC stated that the most serious gap in information arises from the incompleteness of the documentary record. Many records have simply been destroyed. According to a 1935 federal government policy, school returns could be destroyed after 5 years, and reports of accidents after 10 years. This led to the destruction of 15 tons of paper. Between 1936 and 1944, 200,000 Indian Affairs files were destroyed. The TRC also noted that health records were regularly destroyed, or if a record still exists, it lacks the needed detail. For example, it was not uncommon for the principals in their annual reports to state that a specific number of children had died in the previous year, but they did not name those children. It was not until 1935 that Indian Affairs adopted a formal policy on how deaths at the institutions were to be reported and investigated. We now know that many deaths were not reported to Indian Affairs. The TRC located reports of deaths of the children in church records that were not reported in government documents. In addition, in many cases, school officials did not comply with the responsibility to report deaths to the provincial vital statistic offices, which means that even the provincial records are deficient. Notwithstanding the lost, destroyed, hidden, and yet to be found records, there exists an enormous amount of information that can help find the missing children. Survivor statements, the over 5 million records that are now stored at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, provincial government records, including death certificates, burial permits, there are maps and historical aerial photos, and there's the ground-penetrating radar and the LiDAR data that is being collected, and much more. Communities right now are being the data gatherers that Dr. Desi Rodriguez Lone Bear speaks about. Gathering data that has been scattered among various institutions, archives, governments, and even countries. So, how can data science help in the sacred work of finding the missing children? I'm not the right person to answer that question. You are. You are the experts, but let me share with you some of the things we don't have that I think would and could help. First, we don't have a list of names of the children that were taken to Indian residential schools. At the beginning of this talk, I said there were 150,000 First Nations, Métis, Inuit taken to Indian residential schools. No one knows where that number came from. When I worked at the TRC, I asked Canada and the church representatives how they came up with that number. No one knows for sure. I think the number is much higher. But we need more than a number. We need names. Who were these children? Where were they from? Who were their families? I know data science could help in this area. There are many sources where children are named. There just isn't one main source. There are quarterly returns, admission and discharge forms, correspondence between the government and the church representatives, parental letters, medical files, institutional newsletters, newspaper articles, police reports, census records, photographs, death certificates, and many other sources. Communities are reviewing these records, combing through them to find the names of the children, to create a more fulsome and complete picture of who was taken to each institution. Second, once we know who the children were, we then need to know, did they survive? Or did they get released from the institution? Or were they transferred to another institution? What became of them? Did they make it back home? Or are they one of the little ones that are now being found in these unmarked burials across the country? We also know that there is a need to understand the lands that are associated with each institution. The buildings changed over time. Some buildings were moved, additions were made, structures came and went on the lands. Farms were purchased, islands were utilized by the administrators to build homes for the staff, and where they took kids on a daily basis. A full picture is needed of the acres associated with each and every institution. There is also a need to know where the closest cemeteries are. Many children are buried in church and municipal cemeteries. Their parents and families were just never told. These children are part of the missing. Some are even in unmarked burials in formal cemeteries, in areas known as the Aboriginal Cemetery, or Babyland, or the Children's Area. We need to know where these cemeteries are. One of the main concerns I hear when meeting with survivors is the delay in analyzing the ground-penetrating radar data and the other technologies that are being used to find the burials. We have very few experts in Canada that know how to analyze the data for burials. We have a lot of companies and people that know how to use the technology to find pipes and other utilities under the earth. They just don't have the expertise in identifying the burials. Is this something that AI could assist with? Help find the characteristics of a burial in the data? Or at a minimum, eliminate the noise in the data, such as the rocks and the pipes and the roots and the other hidden structures that are not burials. When I speak to international experts on how to investigate genocide, I am told to look for patterns. I see patterns. I see patterns emerging. Where and how the burials are placed. We also see common practices that suggest that medical and pharmaceutical experiments were taking place on the children. quantities of drugs being ordered and delivered to the institutions? Is there a correlation between the deaths, the burials, and the drugs? Finally, we also need to track and trace the perpetrators. Just as there is a need to create a complete list of names of the children who were taken to the institutions, we need a complete list of names of people who worked in the institutions. We need to identify them and flag the known perpetrators and abusers. They were often moved from one institution to another, or they were fired and then hired at a similar type of institution to work with vulnerable people, like at mental health institutions or reformatories. I've just listed 7 areas where I think data science could help. I am sure you can think of many more. What I know is that this sacred work of recovering the missing children in unmarked burials is not an academic exercise. The data, as it's collected and analyzed, will have an impact on real people. And so whatever processes that are put in place, whatever data science that can be utilized to help find the children, must be done in a way that is trauma-informed, survivor-led, and Indigenous governed. I want to end my remarks today by asking you to reflect on how your own work in data science can support survivors, Indigenous families, and communities as they lead this difficult truth-finding process. How can you do this in a way that contributes to reconciliation more broadly? And as the TRC Commissioner said, together, Canadians must do more than just talk about reconciliation. We must learn how to practice it in our everyday lives. Canadians from all walks of life are responsible for taking action on reconciliation in concrete ways. Reconciliation begins with each and every one of us. And with that, I say nawe, thank you, and I hope you have good conversations over the next 2 days. Thank you.